Thank you for your time this morning. We have the entire capstone team here with us, all 6 of us that you've met while we were there at the regional office, as well as Kate, our advisor, Diana, who's been helping us with the data analysis portion of our project, as well as Luam here in the UNFPA New York office. We're excited to share our work with you on supporting UNFPA's family planning capacity and Eastern and Southern Africa. Objectives that you tasked us with at the beginning of this year were to create annual targets for the 16 Family Planning 2020 countries located in East and Southern Africa. And as that developed, we decided to pursue an explanatory model to predict these targets. And the last thing that we'll be speaking on today is our contribution to family planning indicator for women living with HIV, specifically unmet need for family planning. And because the scope of this project was so broad, we decided to give you an overview of what this presentation and this report will include. We are going to speak a little bit to the case study that we did in Uganda, including the expert interviews we did there in Uganda as well as in South Africa. We'll speak a little bit about the rights-based approach that was emphasized in those interviews and was used extensively in our pursuit of an explanatory model, as well as the data analysis that went behind that explanatory model. After that, we'll speak about the limitations that we found in doing this data analysis, as well as the recommendations we have moving forward. And we'll give you also a brief overview of what you can find in our final report that we'll give to you next week. So as you know, we went to Uganda. We will include in our report a literature and policy review of just the background information that is needed to speak a little bit about our expert interviews that we conducted while there.
And so, as Mary Kate mentioned, given the expansive nature of our project and really the family planning space, one of the first realities our team talked about was the critical part of stakeholders and really engaging the many different people involved in this work, other subject matter experts, FP2020 partners and organizations. And so initially we came to UNFPA here in New York City. We met with Urban Institute and Population Council, and from there we really dug deep and researched, crowdsourced 20 other organizations, multilateral, bilateral, civil society organizations, and from those, 11 of them confirmed meetings with us in Uganda and South Africa. We had 3 important goals from meeting with these folks. The first was to help narrow and hone our scope of the project. The second was to gain firsthand context from other experts involved. And the third, and most important really, was solidifying the theoretical framework that would ground our work for the following months. In order to carry out these interviews, we created a baseline questionnaire, and really those questions flexed and evolved. So the data extracted from the questionnaires and from the different intensive interviews really extremely played an important role in our project in terms of the theoretical framework and gaining a tremendous amount of data, context, and perspectives from a lot of different subject matter experts. The Uganda interviews gave us country-specific context and really validated our case study approach. While in Uganda, one of the first folks we met with, or entities, was the Ministry of Health of Uganda, which was foundational in giving us a national context and really understanding Uganda's specific dynamics with the Ministry of Health and Uganda's UNFPA country office. From there, South Africa and our meetings there, we really had a wonderful time meeting with the ISARO specialists and office, as well as other key organizations that gave us more regional foci, which really helped. Both Uganda and South Africa interviews really had a lot of overlaps, and some really key takeaways are detailed in our report, but some of the more broad bucket themes are listed here. Almost everyone really gave their perspectives and definitions on a rights-based approach to family planning, which was extremely interesting. almost everyone talked about informed choice, education, and information, and what that meant to their context. Inclusion and accessibility was also a very emphasized theme, talking about involvement of youth, involvement of boys and men, and gender mainstreaming. Multi-sector coordination was also a key topic in terms of government commitments, civil society, practitioners, and donor demands. And service delivery and uptake was extremely prevalent in our conversations, especially with a strong emphasis on innovation and integration of family planning and HIV services. So from there, having this plethora of data and information, we came back to New York City and really evaluated all that we'd accomplished, both in Uganda and South Africa, and we played around with FPET, the Family Planning Estimation Tool. We used it to run indicators 2 through 4, NCPR, unmet need for modern contraceptives, and demand satisfied by modern contraceptives, and targets for 22 out of the 23 countries will be included in the report. But in doing this exercise, we really started noticing several disparities, and we really became more aware of some disparities in the targets. Number one, significant gaps in data in terms of recentness, availability, and consistency of data sources, as well as was reinforced in all of our conversations with different stakeholders or organizations, a lack of a rights-based approach framework in this. And really, you see this in this example here. We've put Uganda contrasted with South Sudan in this exercise that we performed. And although Uganda has many data points, recent data, and multiple sources, you really see a disparity in the confidence interval being much narrower with Uganda and much more accurate as compared to South Sudan, with less data points and a lower predictive value displayed. So this really had us have a really intense conversation about data itself, and this is what moved us into data analysis.
So, as Pam has mentioned, our fieldwork and interviews with family planning experts, both in Uganda and South Africa, demonstrated to us that we needed to approach setting these targets from the client's perspective. This meant that we needed to create the targets with the inclusion, conceptual focus, and buy-in of the client. We determined that the best way to create a client-centered model would be to use this rights-based approach. We used the existing Family Planning 2020 and United Nations Human Rights frameworks to inform our own project's rights-based approach to family planning. Both these frameworks define a rights-based centered model in where an individual has a fundamental right to decide freely whether, when, and how many children to have. Our hypothesis hoped that a rights-based approach could supplement the existing time series data models and provide more accurate indicator targets for the FP2020 priority countries. To operationalize this approach and give context to this project, we grouped our data into these key categories that you see on the screen, found also within the FP2020 rights framework. It is our hypothesis that the categories most relevant to our case study are availability, quality, and accessibility, which we will discuss further in our data analysis.
So, as Pam highlighted, she walked you through a little bit of what we did with the FPET tool. And she highlighted also some of the limitations that came with that tool. Part of the original proposal that was submitted for the Capstone project had asked the Capstone group to look at different data sources and possibly build upon the FPET model and explore a way of modeling for the different indicators that FPET could not. So in our attempt to do this, what we first did was we took a survey of all the different available data sources that could possibly be used to inform a new model. Those included the DHS, PMA 2020, the World Bank, UN data, among other sources pulled from literature reviews and so on. Once we had built and amassed all that data, there was a need to organize that data, and so we built via Excel a custom database where we could see, based on the 23 different countries in the ESARO region, where that data was, where it was coming from, and what gaps there might possibly be. Once we had that data organized, we as Maureen just mentioned, applied those different data points into the different rights-based approach categories. We highlighted availability, accessibility, and quality of care, but there were other ones that fell in and were properly categorized. Once we had done that, the last step was then to create a hypothesis and run statistical tests with Diana's help to understand what relationships there might be. Once we ran those tests, our hope was those relationships could then be used to inform a model that could help us set better targets using a human rights-based approach for the different FP2020 indicators. So as you can see here, we collected over 100 different variables. It is a lot of information. There's a wealth of information out there. And the problem with all this information is that it's hard to organize, it's hard to see these relationships, and it's hard to understand what other additional data is needed. So this is just to give you a quick visualization of everything that we took a look at. Well, actually, it's not everything that we took a look at, but it's a good deal of what we took a look at. And all this information will be provided in the final report so you can see our methodology. Brianna's going to talk a little bit more now about some of the limitations we faced in creating this model.
Great, thank you. So during the process of looking at the different data points and examining ways that we could use the data to do modeling, we realized that the data really spanned 10 to 15 years in age of when it was collected. And for modeling, it's ideal to have a 1 to 2 year span or a 3 to 5 year max if you want to have valid modeling practices. So unfortunately, right from the beginning, we had challenges with just how many data points from the 100 that Chris discussed we were able to actually use to contribute to running analysis to see if there was correlations. Also, it was inconsistent when we looked at the 16 ESARO countries, which data was available for each variable. So when we identified potential dependent and independent variables, the limitation of data available for the dependent variables, which was all pulled from FP2020, decreased our sample size to 7. There were also inconsistencies with the data available, even though we pulled from different sources. Even within the same source, like DHS reports, the data was sometimes collected differently from one country to another. So, for example, some countries focused on measuring percentages of married women, and other countries measured the same item but for unmarried women. So we were unable to use those data points to compare within even one indicator. There were different data collection methods in general for many of the variables that we tried to use or would have liked to have been able to include. Project design limitations included, it would have been nice if we could have had the time to do additional case studies. The work that we were able to do in Uganda and South Africa really helped inform the direction that we were able to take for our project. And unfortunately, due to limitations in time, that was all that we were able to engage in. Also, access to stakeholders. We had a rich opportunity to engage with the stakeholders that Pam mentioned at an organizational and NGO and governmental level, contributing to the field of family planning. But we really were unable to get to the level of engaging with caregivers and clients at the clinics and health facilities, and that could have added a dimension to our project that would have really enriched the experience and deliverable. And just in general, the time and scope, if having additional time to complete the large deliverable or having a more narrow scope. It was a big undertaking for a team of 6 for a year, and we did really leverage the help and guidance of UNFPA and field experts to be able to narrow the scope and come up with something tangible for a deliverable. And that was great, but in an ideal world, we would have loved to have been able to fulfill every initial item in the proposal.
So despite these limitations, though, we were able to move the ball forward in a tangible way. And so we're excited to share some of our recommendations with you, and then I'll also talk about what we've included in our report. So you can see the progress that we've made, and then hopefully it can be continued after the conclusion of our time. So our first recommendation is really to standardize the use of existing target setting tools like FPET and like Impact2. That's especially important given that the tools address different indicators. So FPET works for indicators 2 through 4, and Impact 2 is for indicators 1, 5 through 8, and 13. And so not only are these two different tools that are used in different ways, but countries also use them differently. And so we think it could be really useful for there to be standard operating procedures to help countries standardize how they use these tools. So they can use the tools to complement each other, the two tools, and then also use the tools in the same way and report the results in the same way. So our next recommendation is really about collaboration and making sure everyone's on the same page. It's especially important when it comes to data collection. To be useful with the FPET and the Impact 2 models, having standardized data collection is important, but also for the explanatory model that Chris was talking about, having data that is collected more regularly and having year intervals for when data is collected match is also critical. So this would mean partnering with agencies that collect data to standardize the data collection, which is critical for data analysis. And also using consistent measures, like Brianna mentioned, a lot of the reports purport to measure the same things, but don't actually when you look at how the data was collected. So that again goes back to standardizing how data is collected. And really what that entails is collaboration of all the stakeholders, making sure that everyone's on the same page and streamlining, and making sure that information is happening, information sharing is happening horizontally as well as vertically. And so, you know, what we see a lot is the regional office sharing information with country offices, and so we think that's a great practice. We also see value in country offices being able to share information upward with the regional office as well as laterally. And this is really to strengthen the partnerships and how information is shared, so that way the understanding, everyone can be on the same page and streamlined. Our next point under collaboration is really to include all the voices, to continue including the voices of lots of different kinds of stakeholders, and that would include women receiving services, local women's groups, local NGOs. Again, one of the things that we found really valuable in our expert meetings was hearing all the different kinds of perspectives that came that were used in the Family Planning 2020. Just how different people view it differently, we found very useful. And then also we find it a really good idea to have some sort of like working group. This could include the other agencies that are working on the family planning agenda or collecting data that is used for the family planning agenda. So this would be like USAID, the World Bank, United Nations, or also having the regional offices and country offices partner at a broader scale with the governments. So one example of this that we saw in Uganda was the Ministry of Health had a really strong partnership with the UNFPA country office there. And it just made it so easy for everyone to set up meetings, to share data. There's just a really casual conversation that was always happening. So next we'd like to talk about where to go from here. Oh, sorry, we're still back one. So one of the important things that obviously is underpinning our project is the immediacy of 2020. It's right around the corner. We only have a few more years, and so what we want to do is make sure that our recommendations can be built upon for sustainability and also to maximize impact. And so what we want to see is, you know, this project furthered as much as possible. And we think that while this is an ambitious endeavor, we think it can be done. And we hope that UNFPA will consider a partnership with Wagner going forward, potentially reaching out to another capstone team. And like I said before, you know, we felt like we've really pushed the ball forward in our report, and we've made a lot of progress, as well as the GPH team. And so we think that if, you know, you were able to contract with another capstone team in a future year, we've really set the table for them to just pick up where we've left off and continue pushing this ball forward, especially given the criticality of the remaining time that we have until 2020. And so lastly, I want to talk about what you'll see in our report that you'll be receiving shortly. We have a lot in there. Like I said, we've set it up so it can be picked up really easily and pushed forward. And so some of the things that we will include in the report is a case study, and this is of Uganda. It provides country-specific information, like Marakit said. We'll talk about the background, history, and then current progress on Family Planning 2020, the Family Planning 2020 agenda. We will also include very detailed analyses of our meetings with experts that we had in Uganda and South Africa. And we'll also include the data analysis that we've done so far. And this includes the methodology to the rights-based approach, which Chris touched on earlier just now. We will also include the FPET targets, and we think that we can also segment these countries and their targets based on the accuracy of the data and the usability of the data. So kind of rank them on which countries the targets are most likely to be accurate for and which ones the targets aren't as accurate for, to really make a connection between the FPET model and then the value that an explanatory model that Chris was talking about could have, as well as why we believe the data collection is so paramount. And then next we will include data resources. This includes where we found our data and then where more data can be found for people who want to move this further. We will also include automated system and visualization resources. This will be system creation resources, interactive visualization resources. Some of the ones that we experimented with were Tableau and Plotly, and so we'll talk about that in the report as well. We will also include a literature review on the indicator for unmet need for family planning among women living with HIV. We will include our data sources, the DHS questionnaire protocol and requirements along those lines, and then also a summary of the expert interview findings. We were able to discuss this with a lot of the experts we met with in South Africa and Uganda, and the main point, as Pam said, was really leveraging and supporting service integration between family planning services and HIV services. And so that we'll talk about more in the literature review in the report. And then lastly, we'll go into much more detail into the recommendations that we talked about earlier. And so that is just a summary of what we'll be sending you soon. And I guess now we'll just open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I remember the picture.
We do too.